The prescribed burn in the Rattlesnake last spring was the first blaze in the area since 1919. It was a first in a series that Lolo National Forest workers hope will eventually rejuvenate forage in more than 2,500 acres of forest land.
We just completed monitoring on this site, and this site now produces about 659 pounds of forage per acre compared to that 30 to 45 before the burn.
Forest Service Fire Manager John Waverick says not only will the prescribed burns bring needed winter forage to elk and deer, the cost will be far less than fire suppression.
Had a fire gotten going on this site in August, we could expect to pay anywhere from $1,000 to maybe $3,000 an acre up here to suppress that fire, and the cost would be anywhere from $1 million to, say, $3 million up here if we had to bring in a team, an overhead team, and 500 to 1,000 firefighters to suppress this fire. So if you're a taxpayer, you have to weigh the cost of $13,000 for a prescribed fire up here versus $1 to $3 million up here for a wildfire in the summertime.
Smoke pollution was one major concern of some Rattlesnake residents when they first learned of the burn. Waverick says in a prescribed burn, fire engineers can control when and under what conditions to start a burn, cutting back on the amount of smoke settling over homes. The Forest Service plans to step up burns in the Missoula district, covering more than 2,500 acres next year. In Missoula, Ian Porter, NBC Montana.
You might remember all those controlled burns we saw around western Montana at the beginning of this summer. The Forest Service is really stepping up its use of controlled fires to restore wilderness habitat. But as Jennifer John reports, some environmentalists say they're skeptical.
Forest managers are doing what they call some serious burning this year in the Lolo National Forest. It's all part of a new push to burn at least 12,000 acres per season. That's a 600% increase in controlled burns from just 5 years ago.
To keep forests healthy, you have to keep fire in the system.
That's a concept that eluded forest managers for nearly 70 years. Efforts to put out every single wildfire created a dense forest thick with underbrush. Fires like these get rid of that underbrush, creating fresh foliage for deer and elk. The goal is to restore that park-like feeling with wide open spaces and big ponderosa pines. Today, forest managers show off this area in the Rattlesnake. Before the fire, this area had about 1,000 little Douglas fir trees per acre. Now there are about 60 per acre, and fire managers say that's still too many.
And it takes repeated events of a fire before you eventually get back to the scattered ponderosa pine that are stable.
Environmentalists at the Native Forest Network agree controlled burns are a good thing, but they're skeptical. They say forest managers often invite commercial logging companies to come in and thin out the area before a controlled burn.
That really provides industry an incentive to push prescribed fire as a method to go in and log areas that haven't been logged before.
This area was not logged before the burn, and foresters are proud of the results. Wildfires usually hit a given area every 5 to 15 years. Until May, this place hadn't seen a spark since 1919. In the Rattlesnake, I'm Jennifer John for Montana's news station.
Fire managers say controlled burns are much smaller and safer than waiting for nature to take its course by sending a wildfire through the area.
The hillside behind us is a steep south-facing slope. We're at about 3,800 feet, which in western central Montana is about as low as you can get. Basically, low elevation valleys are cities, and then we get into these 3,500 to 4,000 foot steep hillsides. Fire history is interesting on these sites. If you think about that aspect and elevation being low and warm because it faces south, they don't get a lot of rain. Consequently, they're prone to burn. If you think about low rain, they're droughty, they don't produce a lot of vegetation. When fires get established, even in a fairly wet year, they tend to burn. So when we look historically at these sites, we'll find fire histories of 5 to 15 years, or fire intervals. In other words, fires would go through fairly frequently. Because they're frequent, they don't burn very intense. In other words, because they're constantly consuming the fuels and because the sites are droughty anyway, what you'll typically have is low-intensity fires. They may burn 3 or 4 or 5 feet. They may kill little trees. They typically avoid the larger trees. Trees that evolve in this site typically are old-growth ponderosa pine, which you'll have at a fairly low density of maybe 15, 20, 30 trees per acre, and with a fairly clean understory of just low shrubs like we see in front of us. Animals have evolved with that fire frequency, and animals are either tolerant of that fire frequency or in many cases are actually dependent on that fire frequency. If you look at big game winter range, deer and elk have to winter on these sites. Higher elevations have too much snow. Lower elevations are occupied by cities. So this is basically where deer and elk have to be during the winter. What they're eating are shrubs for the most part. Elk would prefer grasses, but they're usually covered up by snow. So very quickly in the winter, they're focused on shrubs. And the shrubs are interesting if you look at how they're affected by fire. If you exclude fire for any period of time, like these shrubs were, they typically get tall, woody, and the leaders, which is the palatable part of the plant, become real small. Reason for that is most of the energy of the plant is going into sustaining wood. So if you think about leader production, or the part of the plant that produces forage, there's not a lot available here for elk. If you burn this site off and put fire back on the site, which this represents, this top of the shrub is dead as a result of a prescribed burn last spring, it resprouts like mad. And so the leaders you see here are, in some cases, represent 20%, or a 20-fold increase in biomass as opposed to this. If you just look at it, I mean, compare the difference. This represents about 45 to 60 pounds of forage per acre. This represents about 1,200 pounds of forage per acre. So you can see that 20-fold differential I'm talking about. Putting it real simply, if you want to manage deer and elk in western Montana, you absolutely have to have fire back on the site to keep these shrubs vigorous and productive. There's some other animals that also are very dependent on fire. If you look at this community behind us, it's been burned. This is the second burn in the last 15 years. The trees are now fairly open. You can see they've been pruned up a ways, and those are ideal conditions for flammulated owls. Flammulated owl is a species that evolved on these warm, dry ponderosa pine sites, frequent fire, and they survive by sitting on those lower branches and searching for moths or grasshoppers in the forest community, flying out, grabbing a moth, going back to the branch. If you take fire out of the system and let dense trees come in underneath, flammulated owls disappear. So it's, again, another example of a species that's very, very dependent on frequent fire in these sites.
May 12th of 1997, we burned this site. We burned 900 acres up here on Strawberry Ridge in the Rattlesnake Wilderness area, recreation area. And we had a pretty successful burn. We're real pleased with what happened up here. Mike talked earlier about the benefits to wildlife and the different things that were happening up here, the positive things that happened as a result of that fire. And what I'd like to talk about is some of the other benefits that accrued as a result of the burn that we did this spring. Specifically, I'd like to talk about the costs, comparing this with a wildfire, a controlled burn with a wildfire. I'd like to talk about smoke, wildfire versus a controlled burn, and I'd also like to talk about the hazards, the difference between a wildfire and a controlled burn and what happens. So I'll compare those three. The first thing, the costs up here. On this 900 acres, this spring, we spent $13,000 burning the 900 acres. And that works out to around $13.50 some cents, I believe, per acre. Now, on the same 900 acres, just outside of Missoula here, if we had a wildfire in August up here, we could anticipate spending between $3 and $4 million as a bare minimum. That means if we had a fire up here in August, when conditions were really dry, favorable for a wildfire, we'd call in a Type 1 team, as we call it, and we'd probably be up here a minimum of 10 days to 2 weeks trying to corral a fire of that size and that magnitude. So if you're a taxpayer, you have to compare the two and think about which do you prefer, $13,000 versus $3 to $4 million. The second thing I'd like to talk about is smoke. Any fire generates smoke, and most people don't like it or enjoy it when it occurs or is in their neighborhood or in their home. But when you have a controlled burn like in the springtime, the atmospheric conditions are actually ideal for burning, because what we have is a very unstable atmosphere, and it disperses the smoke a lot better than it does in late summer when you would typically have a wildfire like in August or September up here. In the springtime, we'll come up here, we light a fire, and if the worst case would be that we just have a high that settles in and we get this down canyon effect at night like we had when we burned this, and the folks in the upper end of Rattlesnake were inconvenienced by the smoke. We had some calls and some complaints on that. But if you contrast that with what you would expect in August if we had a wildfire up here, when you have a big high pressure system, as we typically do in August, setting up over this area, we could expect to have anywhere from 7 to 10 days of smoke, down canyon effect at night. And the reason I say that is because the site's a lot drier. You got 900 acres on fire, and you're going to have to go out there with firefighters and address every smoldering stump and every log that's on the ground smoldering and smoking. And so, again, if you live in the Rattlesnake, you have to compare which would you rather have if you're going to have fire up here, and you will have fire. Do you want 1 day, possibly in the springtime, or would you rather endure 7 to 10 days? I think the answer there is obvious. The third thing that I'd like to talk about is hazard. We're up here in the Rattlesnake recreation area, and we've got the main Rattlesnake Trail just down the hill from us, a couple hundred yards. And what that means is we have a lot of people going up and down that trail all summer, year-round basically. But when you think about all the people that go up and down that trail and the folks that stop and have a little campfire or a little warming fire or something like that, the potential for getting an ignition in here is really great. You could convert all those people to potential ignition sources is another way we might look at it in fire management, the potential for getting a fire up here, a wildfire. And it is great, and I can look back at the records, and I have up here, and every year we typically come up here and we chase at least 3 or 4 campfires that somebody didn't put completely out. So what we've done this spring by putting fire back on the landscape basically is we've removed some of the fuel here. So if we do get a fire that occurs in August, be it a wildfire or a man-caused fire, we're going to expect less resistance to control because we've already taken the preemptive action of removing fuel from the site by doing the ecosystem burn that we did up here.